Hello, A-Pushers. Mr. Ristau here. We are going to be going through the notes here for Chapter 22. I mentioned in my update from a couple of days ago, I also mentioned in class yesterday, Friday, that I would be making a video lecture about or on Chapter 22. And Chapter 22 covers, by and large, the decade of the 1920s. So I encourage you to watch this, certainly between now and Wednesday. Remember, Wednesday is going to be your summative exam on chapters 21 and 22. And we aren't necessarily going to go through content notes on Monday or Tuesday. So this is going to serve as the lecture on those notes if we were to do that Monday and Tuesday. Remember, we moved up the exam to Wednesday. Okay? So let's get right to it. This is going to be the material covering the 1920s. This is chapter 22 of the textbook. Just a little preview slide. Here are the items that we're going to be covering here in the video lecture. Items such as the Red Scare. Remember, this is the time period now. World War I is over. The world is trying to be put back together again in the United States. People are somewhat disillusioned with the war, I guess, which basically means, and what I'm referring to by that, is that the United States we kind of want to separate ourselves from Europe and European problems because World War I at the time technically was supposed to be the war to end all wars. So we want to return to normalcy. You see that's one of the themes or concepts here on the list. We got a new amendment that is going to be trying to be added to the U.S. Constitution. We're now talking President Wilson and then a series of 3 Republican presidents in the 1920s, Harding, Coolidge, and President Hoover by the end of the decade. All right, so we're kind of moving up through the 1920s. We'll be talking a little bit about the impact of the automobile that would have on the decade. And by the time the decade is over, the United States and a lot of the world would find itself in a major economic depression. Okay. Following World War I, we talked about actually during World War I, the Communist Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, came to power in the Soviet Union. In Russia, they became the Soviet Union. It was known as the Bolshevik Revolution. And remember, Lenin negotiated his own peace treaty, Russia's own peace treaty with the Germans during World War I. And they left World War I, and the Communist Party comes to power in the Soviet Union. One of the other things that starts to take place, specifically in the United States, is there are many labor strikes that occurred during 1918, 1919, and many important industries begin to shut down. For example, the steel industry, the Boston police strike of 1919. So there are a lot of labor issues that are taking place into the late teens and into the 1920s. And you can see the political cartoon here indicating that these were primarily coast to coast. These were not specific to just one location across the country. Race riots also took place, particularly in the north, northern American cities. And these, by and large, took place because of resentment that African Americans had toward largely immigrants who had been coming over. Remember in that wave of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, resentment towards taking jobs, competition for jobs, but also housing. So a combination of strikes, labor strikes taking place, some of which were quite violent, and race riots. You had a lot of unrest, a lot of political and social unrest throughout the North. You had bombings, for example, in many of these strikes in 8 large American cities, particularly New York and Chicago. And if you remember your history, this seems to have been kind of an off and on theme in labor and union history going back to 1870 and 1880 with those major strikes that we talked about during the early part of the Gilded Age. This period in American history, early 1920s, is known as the Red Scare. The word red here referring to communism, the essence of communism, the essence that the idea that labor is radical in some way, that unions are radical, that they're being infiltrated with communists, that they're bringing perhaps or adopting radical ideas to some of these labor unions. and that equates to violence in the workplace or during strikes. And that was indicative, a lot of people believed, in these bombings that started to take place throughout the United States. So as a result of this Red Scare, this idea that communism was beginning to take hold in the United States through labor and unions, the Attorney General of the United States, A. Mitchell Palmer, who you see sitting here, led a series of raids against who the government believed were suspected radicals. So these could have been labor unions, they could have been people in business, people in perhaps even eventually we're going to see people in government. All right. And I'm not going to throw out the word witch hunt quite yet, but that's what it would turn into by the 1930s and 40s, and certainly after World War II into the 1950s. All right. So there was this essence of kind of paranoia that started to seep into American society as early as the 1920s. The 1920s, think of the 1920s as a decade, I like to think of the 1920s as a decade of contradictions. Because, and I kind of liken it to the Gilded Age, all right? It was, for a lot of people, a very successful, very prosperous decade. The economy was roaring, it was simply known as the Roaring 20s. And for a lot of people did benefit from a very successful economy. The stock market was booming, and new technology, new innovations, et cetera, and, mass consumerism. However, the decade did not roar for everybody, primarily farmers and unions. And this is, again, one of the similarities with the Gilded Age. In fact, union membership, and it shouldn't surprise you based on what I just showed you in the previous slide, union membership declined throughout the 1920s. Companies would favor what's called an open shop, which means that jobs were open only to non-union workers, okay? And that right there would cut down on the number of union members. Between the Red Scare, you can see the cartoon in the lower left here, the strikes, the massive steel strike, for example, that took place, the Palmer raids that were led by A. Mitchell Palmer and the FBI and the U.S. government. All of these things had turned public opinion against labor and labor unions. Okay, so that's kind of where labor and unions stand during the 1920s. As far as farmers go, farmers experienced one of the worst decades they have had up to this point. A lot of economic difficulty. Europe stopped buying a lot of foodstuffs after World War I. There was less demand for crops from domestic and international markets in general. So this led to huge surpluses and huge excess supplies of goods, agricultural goods in the United States, which drove prices down. And farmers were not getting, of course, the same high prices as they were during and before the war. And since so many of them already were in debt, or they had to take out a sizable debt to pay for their farm and whatnot, to put a crop in the ground each year, many of them were going bankrupt. So in the 1920s, farmers were already experiencing pretty much a Great Depression of their own, okay? So that by the time the real Great Depression comes along in the 1930s, the one that is countrywide and globally, farmers are really going to suffer in the 1930s. In addition to Europe not buying as much, or the world not buying as much agricultural goods from the United States, the advancements in technology, in a very weird, ironic sort of way, actually led to more production. And you would think that's a great thing, right? But more production just led to more surplus, which led to lower prices. So technology actually acted as a deterrent to higher prices, and actually a deterrent to helping farmers out. As far as politics of the 1920s go, we're talking now kind of the aftermath of the progressive reforms, right? We've talked about progressivism. You had a DBQ about progressivism. Progressivism largely was around 1900 or so to 1920. The progressive era reforms, the politicians between Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, pretty much are abandoned in the 1920s. They lasted for about 20 to 25 years. And then, like I said earlier, 3 Republican presidents came into power, and Congress was largely controlled by Republicans, and they went a different direction. In fact, to a certain extent, they went back to the direction like the country was in the Gilded Age, where we found business and government very closely linked together. All right, so here are three presidents that we're going to see in the 1920s. Warren Harding, who is not going to be in office all that long. He is going to die in office by 1923. Coolidge is going to finish his term, and then he will be elected to one term, essentially, until 1929. And then Hoover, his name should ring a bell, because he was in charge of the Food Administration in the U.S. government during World War I. So those are our three presidents. And Harding takes over running on a campaign of a slogan of return to normalcy. And I referred to that in the second slides there. And then, like I said, Coolidge and Hoover will follow. Now, one of the things about the 1920s, and really with all three of these presidents, the mantra was the business of America is going to be business. All right, Republican presidents are going to favor, you guessed it, high tariffs. Right, we've talked about this now for what seems to be probably 100 years, and that is Republicans raise R like a higher tariff throughout the decade to protect American business, and they're going to implement many pro-business policies to protect American business, to get the economy moving again, and really stimulating the economy that way. One major tariff that's going to be passed is the Fordney-McCumber tariff, which is going to increase the tariff or the tax on many imported goods, again to protect American industry. And the response to that tariff was that Europe was going to raise tariffs of their own. And what this does is that it sets off over the next 8 to 10 years or throughout the decade, basically kind of a tariff war. So that when one side would raise tariffs, the other side would raise tariffs. And all that really did was stifle trade. All right, so we're going to see that as one of the major causes of the Great Depression by 1930. Global trade slows down, and the close relationship that exists between business and government is going to lead to some really kind of slimy scandals involving high-ranking federal government officials, officials of the Harding administration. It's going to lead to a lot of corruption. And this should sound familiar because this is exactly what happened, we know, during the Gilded Age with President Grant's administration and the relationship that government and business had then. All right, now, no one is insinuating or knows that Harding had anything to do with these scandals. There's no evidence to suggest that he did. It was mainly his cabinet officers and some other federal office holders. For example, the most famous scandal was known as the Teapot Dome scandal. It involved the Secretary of Interior, Albert Fall, and here you see a famous cartoon, where Albert Fall, the Secretary of the Interior, accepted bribes. He accepted payments, and in exchange, these payments came, for example, from the oil industry. And in exchange, he promised to lease government oil fields to oil companies. Well, of course, that was completely against the law. And so it was scandals like that that got the Harding administration in a lot of trouble. By August of 1923, Warren Harding will die in office, and Calvin Coolidge will take over. And Coolidge's nickname was Silent Cal, because anybody who knew Calvin Coolidge, he just didn't talk. He was a man of very few words, and the running joke with Calvin Coolidge was somebody had said to him, "Mr. Coolidge, I've made a bet against a fellow who said it was impossible to get more than 2 words out of you." And the joke, of course, is Calvin Coolidge said, "You lose." And the first time I had heard that, I thought that was pretty funny. But the more I found out about Calvin Coolidge, is that he was not a big talker. He didn't give a lot of speeches, and he didn't have a lot to say. He was more of a thinker. Coolidge and Hoover continued the policies of Warren Harding, so that means pro-business. Coolidge's famous quote was, "The business of America is business." So again, they kept in line, keeping that close, that symbiotic relationship between business and the government. And here you see is his campaign slogan. I suppose you would call it a flyer or a pamphlet of sorts, "Keeping cool with Coolidge." This came from the 1924 election. Remember, he finished off Harding's last year and then he decided to run and was elected to a 4-year term. Okay, so he easily wins the 1924 election. You can see all the states here that Coolidge carried are in blue, and the lone exception there is the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin elected their famous Senator Robert La Follette. We've talked about him before, the progressive senator from Wisconsin. And then the states there in red are the states that were carried by the Democratic candidate. Okay. Like I said, Robert La Follette was the Progressive Party candidate. The Progressives still nominated a candidate, and he was able to get about 2.5% of the vote. He did actually surprisingly well. 2.5% maybe doesn't sound like a lot, but for a third-party candidate at that time, that's quite good. And Robert La Follette did particularly well, as you'd expect, among farmers and workers. Coolidge will not run in 1928. He could have, constitutionally, he could have run for a second term, but he will choose to step down in 1928. So that means by 1927-28, the Republican Party will nominate Herbert Hoover for president, and he's going to be running against the Democratic candidate Alfred E. Smith. And this election is going to be quite controversial in the sense that religion, largely for the first time in American history, is going to play a major role in the presidential campaign. Alfred E. Smith was Catholic, so Catholicism is going to become a major campaign issue. And in 1928, one of the reasons why he lost is that Americans were now ready to elect a Catholic as president, because as you see here in the cartoon, the worry was people thought that by electing someone who was Catholic to a high office like the White House, he would be taking orders and whatnot, following advice from the Pope. So many Americans didn't go for that, and they elected Hoover as president. Smith was also opposed to prohibition. Remember, the 1920s, this is the decade of prohibition. This is a decade when the temperance movement finally was able to add an amendment to the Constitution, the 18th Amendment, that banned the sale, manufacturing, and distribution, transportation of alcohol, and known as prohibition. Well, he was opposed to prohibition, all right? So he was known as the quote-unquote wet candidate. By 1928, prohibition isn't going so well, but it wasn't enough to get him elected. This was largely a campaign based on religion, or the issue surrounding religion. So if we backtrack a little bit, remember the Palmer raids I talked about? These were raids on suspected radicals within labor organizations and unions and people who maybe were suspected of not being loyal to the country. What these raids did, and we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of people were arrested. These raids led to massive arrests. The U.S. government arrested socialists, so-called anarchists, union organizers, any people that the government suspected of being radicals, quote-unquote radicals. And during the 1920s, we've talked about nativism before. In fact, this term nativism goes all the way back, 100 years. This anti-immigrant sentiment that a lot of Americans had. And this continued hatred, known as nativism, this hatred toward immigration, would continue right through the 1920s. And it was targeted mainly for these, quote, new immigrants. And this is a great cartoon in the sense that it's extremely famous, but it really shows you what the U.S. government did, what our immigration policy was regarding immigrants during the 1920s. Remember I told you that during this wave of immigration that started from Southern and Eastern Europe, 1870s, 80s, 90s, all the way up to the 1900s, I told you a couple of weeks ago that U.S. immigration policy was going to be very strict in terms of the number of immigrants that we would allow in. Evidence of that is the Quota Act of 1929, and you can see Uncle Sam there with his funnel, kind of funneling in, letting through a certain quota, a certain number. And what this particular piece of legislation did is it limited the number of immigrants to 3% of those living in the United States as of 1910, So if there were 1 million Italians living in the U.S. in 1910, We were only going to allow 3% of that in 1921 under this new act. All right, so it really cut the numbers down. The National Quota Act is another piece of evidence of this, 1924. This set the quota at 2% of the immigrants that lived in the U.S., but now it's based on 1890. Okay, so if you do the math, or just common sense, there are going to be fewer immigrants by and large in 1890 than there were in 1910. So now it's just 2% instead of 3%. So we're continuing to, kind of tighten the screws, if you will, or turn off the faucet, to use kind of a sink or a bathtub analogy of letting just a few immigrants in. Going back to the cartoon here, Uncle Sam, the government is only allowing a very limited number of immigrants in from across Europe. And this is specifically Southern and Eastern Europe. Okay, that's usually what it was. Those were the types of immigrants that were targeted. We're not talking about Western Europe mainly. We're talking about Southern and Eastern Europe that is being severely limited. Asian immigrants were also severely restricted. We did not allow any Japanese into the country at all. So this kind of rings a bell to the Chinese Exclusion Act, right, back in 1883. So this is a period, again, 1880s, 90s, 1900s, all the way up to about 1920, 1930, where U.S. immigration policy is quite severe in terms of limiting the number of immigrants into the country, okay? As far as the Western Hemisphere goes, Central America, South America, Canada, right, there was unrestricted immigration. So again, this was largely targeted at Southern and Eastern Europeans, okay? Typical cartoon that you might be asked to hip, you might see this. Plenty of times the College Board has asked on DBQ prompts, for example, an immigration policy or an immigration type question. I put this in the slideshow just so to call your attention to make sure you can put this cartoon in context. Who might the audience be? We might even do this in class, for example, on Monday or Tuesday, what the purpose of this cartoon is and what the point of view of it is. You should be able to sit here for a few minutes and ask yourself those questions. All right, and again, you know what this is, the hip skill as part of the DBQ. All right, one of the most famous court cases that came out of the period actually was linked to and connected to nativist feelings, people's feelings towards Southern and Eastern Europeans, in this case Italians, and that was the Sacco and Vanzetti case. Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian immigrants. They were charged with armed robbery of essentially what we'll consider a convenience store type place, and murder in 1921. Long story short, they were both found guilty and they were sentenced to death. Now, there has been a lot of controversy surrounding Sacco and Vanzetti, but with the 1920s, there's a lot of symbolism that takes place, and this trial of these two men is another example of the symbolism that takes place. The trial became a symbol simply because it demonstrated the tensions that existed during the era. The tension surrounding nativism, the tension surrounding immigration, because Sacco and Vanzetti, they had publicly stated that they were anarchists, but that doesn't necessarily make them murderers, right? So a lot of people believed at the time that these two were executed because simply they were Italian, they were immigrants, and it fed into that prevailing feeling of the day that was nativism. Evidence that was made available later, decades later, suggests that they probably did commit the crime because of the weapon that was found and whatnot. But that feeling of, were they executed because they were Italians, that was still prevalent in society at the time. And it's a great example of the tensions that existed during the era. Anti-Italian immigrant, and anarchist. They were World War I draft dodgers, so they had a lot of things against them. But again, that doesn't make them murderers. So it was a very controversial case, and like I said, both men were executed in 1927. So if you want to read up a little more about Sacco and Vanzetti, certainly feel free to do so. I bring it up here mainly to show you that this is, like I said, kind of a symbol and a great example of the anti-immigrant fervor that existed during the 1920s. Also, example of nativism. We had a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, right? This was the anti-black, anti-Catholic organization, the extremist terrorist, domestic terrorist organization that was founded shortly after the Civil War. Well, they, in their heyday, 1865 to about 1875, 1880, 85, and then we saw numbers dwindle in the KKK, but now they're starting to make a huge comeback, and they start to broaden their influence in the 1920s here. They start to expand into the Midwest, specifically into Indiana. Okay, there were nearly 4 to 5 million members of the KKK by the middle of the 1920s. And this is kind of a new KKK. The hatred now is being extended to immigrants, but also radicals, Catholics, and they are still anti-black. There was a pro-KKK film known as Birth of a Nation. It was extremely popular in theaters during that time. In fact, President Wilson would show this film in the White House. He actually showed this film in the White House in around 1915, 1916 when it came out. It was a silent film. And on some lists of the greatest films of all time, this is actually on one of those lists. And I think it has to do with the fact that it's a silent film. And the cinematography, the technology of the day is one of the reasons why it's on that list. But anyway, the director was D.W. Griffith, and this is his claim to fame, the very racist film about the KKK, Birth of a Nation. The KKK branded itself as a patriotic organization. Right here you see them walking on the streets of Washington. They conducted protests. They were in parades. They walked the streets of Washington, D.C., with the Capitol there you see in the background. And most of their political support came from white Protestants and from the rural parts of the United States, small towns, small cities, and like I said, rural parts of the country. They exerted tremendous political influence by the middle of the decade, by the 1920s. In fact, it's somewhere around 7 or 8 states where the KKK had political control of state capitals, legislatures. So they had a lot of influence, like I said, especially in rural parts of the country and small towns and small cities in the United States. All right, so the KKK is making a huge comeback in the 1920s. Now, the 1920s, nicknamed appropriately the Roaring Twenties, is largely nicknamed the Roaring Twenties because of the economy. 1920 was the first time that most Americans are living in urban areas. Okay? Remember I told you that shortly after the Civil War into the Gilded Age, we start to see a shift, slowly but surely, of people moving from cities to the country. Or excuse me, from countries to the cities. And it would take largely the better part of 60 years or so before finally, you can see here on the bar graph, where most of American population now live in cities, 51-49. It would take about 60 years for that to happen. And there was a roaring prosperity to the economy. There was tremendous growth in the stock market. People would buy stock on what is called margin. In other words, people would borrow. They would borrow money to go out and buy stock, hoping that the stock would do well. And of course, if the stock did well, they could pay back their debt and they could pay their broker. And what separated the market from markets of the past is that anybody could play the market during the 1920s. You didn't have to be rich. The problem was a lot of the investment was based on speculation, right? And the other thing you have to remember is that the stock market of the 1920s is not the stock market of the 2020s. The stock market back then, 100 years ago, was not regulated. It was hardly regulated at all. So there was massive corruption, lots of cheating, a lot of pools that were being created by wealthy investors who would drive up the price of stock and then give everyone the impression that the stock was doing well, and then they'd sell immediately. They would reap all the benefits, and everybody else, like me, for example, would lose everything. But people played the market, and it was one of the ways that people were doing well financially. The problem was, again, the companies that a lot of people were investing in, the prices of their stock was artificially high. So in other words, it really didn't represent, the price of their stock really didn't represent how well the company was doing. Okay. Along with the stock market during the 1920s was mass consumption was taking place. Americans were spending huge sums of money, lots of debt, national debt was being driven up, consumer debt, and there was a large number of new affordable goods that people were buying that were available. For example, you can see in the picture here, washing machines, right? That was a new appliance that people were buying. Refrigerators, all kinds of things. Google, for instance, when you have a second, new inventions or technology in the 1920s. Again, it really reminds you of the Gilded Age. Remember the worksheet we had, the exercise we did, the activity we did in class of all the inventions, the new inventions that came about in the 1870s and 80s? Again, a similarity to the 1920s, all the new different kinds of appliances, for example, not even to mention the automobile. Electricity is making its way from the cities to rural parts of the country. So electricity in homes is going to lead to more demand for consumer goods. And fueling this consumerism is this thing called credit, or the installment plan. The idea that you could buy these things now and pay for them later. Okay, now I'm not talking about a credit card. All right, credit cards have not been invented yet. But I'm talking about the idea that you could walk into a store, right, purchase, let's say, this washing machine here, and you could buy it on credit. So you would set up some sort of payment plan with the owner of the store, and you would make payments to the owner of that store. Okay? No such thing as plastic yet. All right, so no Visas or American Express or anything like that. That's still down the road. The 1920s was also the decade where mass advertising would start to take place. Billboards, these works of art that you would see up and down the roads and highways, and advertising in magazines, right? This was a decade of mass marketing to mass consumers. This became in and of itself a huge industry to try and manipulate consumer demand. There were also massive transportation changes that would take place. Remember Frederick Taylor and his ideas behind scientific management and efficiency? The 1870s and 80s and 90s. Remember, he came along and said, you know, if firms and whatnot followed these principles of scientific management, they could become more efficient. They would increase productivity. Well, Henry Ford was one of those people, too, that would kind of follow in the footsteps of Frederick Taylor. And automobiles became extremely affordable for the average American, most notably the Model T. Henry Ford dominated the automobile industry. And what Henry Ford did is that he did not invent the automobile and he did not invent the assembly line. Both had been around. But what he did is he made the assembly line conducive, and he made it work for him in order to mass produce cars. That's what he did. And he produced Model Ts to the tune of about 15 million of them by the time the decade was over. All right. Now, they primarily came in one color, black. But eventually they would come in more than one color. But what the impact that the automobile had on America was staggering. It's too much to explain right here in this video. But if you think about it, the automobile would affect, right, other industries. Everything that the automobile would need, new industries would pop up, like steel industries, the rubber industry, the glass industry, the gasoline industry, highway construction. The list goes on and on and on. This would continue on well into the 50s and 1960s. Okay. Another major change in transportation, of course, was the airplane, or flying travel. Charles Lindbergh would be the face of this new kind of transportation when he made when he was the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, 1927. Here he's standing by his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. If you've ever been to D.C., to the Smithsonian Museum of American History, you'll see the Spirit of St. Louis hanging there from the ceilings. It's super cool. So if you ever get out there and get a chance to see it, I really encourage you to do that. Lindbergh, of course, was from Minnesota, right? He is a Minnesotan. And radio during the 1920s was the means of communication, right? There's no television yet. Of course, there's no internet or anything like that. But TV is about 20 years away yet. So it was radio that people used to communicate, and radio made Charles Lindbergh basically an international celebrity. Okay. Speaking of mass media, I already mentioned radio. Here you can see that during the 20s, how many households actually had a radio and what happened really between 1924 and 1930. It was staggering. The first radio broadcast came out of Pittsburgh, and it was actually the presidential election when Warren Harding was elected. Radio was one of those things, much like what TV would do in the 40s and 50s, and again, what the internet and computers would do in the 1980s and 90s and 2000s, is that it tied the country together, right, and made the country smaller. People for the first time were feeling they were all in this together, right? Like we were one country, we were sharing experiences, we were all listening to the same things. And with radio came movies. There were already movies. These were silent movies before the 1920s. The silent movies in Hollywood, the birth of Hollywood, would take place during the 1920s. And the first movie with film actually was The Jazz Singer. This is also, I believe, on one of the lists, the top 100 greatest movies of all time list, because it was the first movie with sound. Movies with sound back then were known as talkies. All right. This is also a decade of celebrityism. All right. Pop culture, celebrity culture. Here you're taking a look at probably the biggest celebrity, one of them ever, certainly in the decade, and that's Babe Ruth. I'm sure you've all heard of Babe Ruth, the famous New York Yankee, the baseball player. And between radio, the love of sports, the love of baseball, in this case, these people, in this case, these men became nationally known figures as a result of radio and movies. They became celebrities. As far as gender identification goes in the 1920s, we have social customs that were being challenged. Remember I said this was a decade of challenges. It was a decade of contradictions. It was a decade of also youth challenging the older part of America, the older generation. We had new things like jazz music and dancing and drinking illegal alcohol. Remember, this was, again, the decade of prohibition. These were people that were challenging the traditional values in American society. Okay, there were labor-saving devices that were changing the roles of homemakers and women, for example, the vacuum cleaner, the blender, again, like I said, the washing machine. All of these things, right, that were changing roles for women inside the home. You had kind of cultural symbols, women known as flappers. Flappers were more symbols of this more independent woman that started to take shape in the 1920s. A flapper was someone who, like I said, was much more independent than her mother was during the Victorian age of the 1890s or early 1900s. Here you see 4 flappers. They were very carefree with their dancing. Notice the dress they have on, right? And how they wore their hair. Flappers were probably women that you would see smoking in public, something that was very looked down upon during the Victorian age. And then you had also Margaret Sanger defending her battle for the right of birth control, not parental rights, but family planning. Those kinds of rights came through in the 1920s, or those kinds of issues came through with women in the 1920s. And then also another symbol, another famous trial that challenged the fundamental traditional values of the United States and American society was that of the Scopes Monkey trial. And the decade was full of this. This was ongoing, this battle between the values of modernizing cities versus the traditional values of the rural areas. You had people who were known as fundamentalists. Fundamentalists are people who believe that every word in the Bible is true and should be taken as literal truth. Radio preachers like Billy Sunday would speak out against the evils of drinking and the evils of dancing, and he would be very much this guy, Billy Sunday, certainly would be very much against flappers and everything that flappers stood for, right? He would be against jazz music. He would be against gambling. These were all vices. Well, the Scopes monkey trial centered around Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. And in the state of Tennessee, there was a law, it was known as the Butler Act. That act forbid, it outlawed the teaching of evolution in Tennessee schools. And the ACLU approached this man, John Scopes, asking him if he would challenge the law. Scopes was a high school science teacher, and asked him if he would challenge the law by teaching evolution. This was in 1925 in the Tennessee high school that he was working in. And he said that he would. He knew full well it was against the law. And this trial was made or took place to set an example, not an example of Scopes, but to challenge the law and show everybody how ridiculous the law was. Okay, the entire world would follow this trial. Again, listening to it on the radio, it's known as the Scopes monkey trial. So on one side, you had Clarence Darrow. He was the foremost defense attorney in the country at the time. He would represent Scopes over here on the far left. And then Jennings Bryan, you should recognize William Jennings Bryan. Remember him, Cross of Gold speech, right? Progressive back in the 1890s. He, former presidential candidate 3 times, he would represent the state of Tennessee. He was the prosecutor. And long story short is that Scopes was convicted, no big surprise. I believe he was fined $100, but eventually the verdict was thrown out on a technicality, so in the end, nothing really happened, except the trial gaining worldwide attention and drawing attention to this building issue, right, between fundamentalism and this new wave of these new elements that are going through pop culture at the time in the United States, okay? The trial demonstrated, again, the tensions that existed between modern America, and that's really what's happening in the 1920s. The country's becoming more modern, but at the same time, many people want to hold on to the traditional values. And when a society does that, that's what can lead to a lot of tension, okay? And that's one of the characteristics of the 1920s. I said before, the decade was the decade of Prohibition, right? This goes back decades. Right, groups of people, organizations trying to get alcohol banned in the United States. We had the temperance movement, certainly, post-Civil War. By 1919, the 18th Amendment would be ratified. It would prohibit the manufacture and sale and transportation of alcoholic beverages, and this was countrywide. Okay. The Volstead Act was the federal piece of legislation. This was the law that put bite into the 18th Amendment, right? So this made it illegal. You could be arrested. It was the federal law that was enforcing the amendment. There was plenty of opposition, especially in larger cities. And what you started to see in many large cities, for example, New York, you would see thousands of illegal bars start to pop up. They were known as speakeasies. And the liquor they were serving was known as bootleg liquor. This was liquor or alcohol that was made and transported and sold illegally in many of these places, right? The problem with Prohibition, one of them anyway, is that there were just too few law enforcement officers to try and enforce the Volstead Act around the country. There just weren't enough law enforcement officers, not enough FBI and Treasury officers to enforce this law, and by and large, the 18th Amendment was a complete failure. Prohibition failed in the end. It actually led to widespread corruption. Law enforcement, police officers were in on the take. There was even stories that Warren Harding and the presidents of the United States were running alcohol in and out of the White House during Prohibition. That's how big of a failure it was. It also gave way to the rise of organized crime and the mafia in the United States, namely Al Capone, who was probably the most famous mobster, headquartered in Chicago. And he made millions upon tens of millions of dollars, if not hundreds of millions in today's money, through the bootlegging of illegal alcohol. the sale and distribution of alcohol. All right, so you had scenes like this, people protesting prohibition, so that by 1933, prohibition would end. Okay. Now, as far as African Americans go, I mentioned in chapter 21 that there would be a large migratory movement, right, of African Americans from south to north. And this would take place largely because of World War I, right? There were economic opportunities in the north. Many African Americans would find jobs in American industries, war industries in the north. So this map gives you a good idea of where they were headed. Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, New York City. The spread of jazz music, this new kind of genre of music that was founded in the 20s, is going to spread out of New Orleans, and it's going to spread and take hold throughout America. Harlem becomes the epicenter of African American culture during the 1920s. It was known as the Harlem Renaissance. Renaissance is Italian. It means a rebirth. So here we have a cultural rebirth of sorts among African Americans in New York, and it was led by writers like Claude McKay, Langston Hughes. Those are the biggies. Zora Hurston, and then, of course, the famous trumpeter Louis Armstrong. All right. One of the prevailing ideas of the day during the Harlem Renaissance was by Claude McKay, the idea of what he called the new Negro, that African Americans must find and take a new sense of racial pride in their culture. Men like Marcus Garvey, who founded the United Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA, he actually called for separatism during this time. What Marcus Garvey is largely known for, besides finding the UNIA, is that he was calling for African Americans to actually go back to Africa. It was known as his Back to Africa movement, and he promoted Black pride. He called on African Americans to own Black businesses and eventually travel back to Africa and separate from white American society. Sometimes the 1920s also refers to a group of people known as the Lost Generation. These were the people that wrote, these are kind of some of the biggest writers and authors, many of these people you have heard of in American literature. They would write about the problems with American society. So again, this likens the 20s to the Gilded Age, right? On the surface, there was a lot of prosperity, a lot of good things were going on, but there were also a lot of issues and a lot of problems in the Gilded Age. Well, the same thing with the 1920s. The group of people that tried to expose a lot of these problems and kind of bring to light, I wouldn't call them muckrakers, but they did write about some of society's ills. Scott Fitzgerald, of course, he's famous for The Great Gatsby. Ernest Hemingway, a lot of his novels are about war and how horrible war is. His life during World War I. Ernest Hemingway served in World War I. Sinclair Lewis, another Minnesotan, and Scott Fitzgerald, a Minnesotan. So these were three biggies, right? These are kind of the titans of American literature. They would criticize the different aspects of the 1920s. For example, why did we fight in World War I? What was it good for? Small town values, fundamentalism and religious views. Criticized the emphasis on materialism during the 1920s and mass consumerism. All right, so they were the lost generation. All of that was largely domestic. So what about international affairs? Where do we stand? Well, remember that at the end of World War I, the United States rejected the League of Nations. We did not join the League of Nations. We did not accept that part of the peace treaty that ended World War I. But during the 1920s, the United States doesn't entirely withdraw from world affairs. For example, we became part of and we led the Washington Naval Arms Conference. Okay. Now, basically what that did is that we tried to promote naval disarmament. This wasn't a conference where we're trying to eliminate weapons of mass destruction or bombs or anything like that. Those don't exist. But what we tried to do is we tried to promote peace, especially in the Pacific. We would try to cut down on our defense expenditures, our defense spending, and we would try to eliminate the number of warships in our Navy. That was 1921. There were a series of treaties that came out of this conference, the 5, 4, and 9 power treaty. And I'll try and sum these up here. You can see that most of them set quotas for the number of battleships that England, the United States could possess. The 4 power treaty signed with England, US, France, and Japan. We would respect our territory in the Pacific. And then we have the 9 power treaty that all countries that were involved in this conference would respect the open door policy as it relates to China and trade. If you remember the open door policy from the 1880s and 90s. All right, so this was, like I said, the reason I'm showing you this is just to let you know we didn't become 100% isolationist. And just because we didn't become part of the League of Nations doesn't mean that we were completely, on our own. The other pact that we did sign was the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This was a pact that was signed in 1928 by around 60 to 70 countries that promised to outlaw war. They promised to try to settle their problems diplomatically through conversation and not war. The problem with this one, of course, as you guessed it, this was unenforceable. It's not like there was a police force that was, arresting countries when they broke the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And it only allowed really for defensive wars, okay? And again, the United States was part of this. But by and large, the United States was largely a neutral country during the 1920s. Our foreign policy was largely one of neutrality, okay? As far as international finance goes, after World War I, the United States is becoming a creditor nation for the first time. And what that means is, before World War I, we were a large debtor nation. We were the ones who were borrowing money, okay, from other countries. After World War I, we were more like the bank for other countries. We were the ones who were lending the money to European countries who were trying to recover from World War I. These countries like France, Great Britain, Germany, they were very slow to recover after World War I. Right? Remember, after World War I, part of the peace treaty is that Germany was basically left with the bill, about $33 billion worth, to pay for World War I, and it was almost impossible for them to pay. And the European countries had a lot of war debts to the United States that they owed. When you combine that with the high tariffs, remember the high tariffs that the U.S. government is starting to raise, that's going to weaken international trade. Germany, because they were left with the bill for World War I, could not pay, certainly, this war reparation, and the nation was bankrupt. They were suffering from massive inflation, and it was almost impossible for them to recover. Okay. Now, the United States came up with a plan known as the Dawes Plan. This too would fail. But the idea was to adjust the German debt so that they could pay it back. And the idea was American banks would loan Germany the money to help them rebuild their economy. And then once their economy would be rebuilt and prosperous, that would generate, goods and services, and, they could pay back France and Europe then. England and France then would take their money and whatnot. They would help recover and rebuild, and they would use their payments from Germany to pay back their loans to the United States. That was the triangle. That was the idea. But the Dawes plans actually in the end failed because by 1929, the stock market would crash and the world would fall into a Great Depression. Okay. So the Great Depression is going to begin. This chapter does end with the Great Depression, with the stock market crashing. There was tremendous speculation surrounding stock prices. Remember I said earlier that people kept bidding up stock prices when people would invest in the stock market. They would buy on margin. They would borrow heavily. There was a huge amount of debt that had been built up by consumers. And the prices of these stocks did not accurately reflect the true value of the stock or the company. Black Tuesday, October 29th, the famous day, 1929, 16 million shares of stock were sold and the stock market begins to plunge. Think of the stock market crash as the trigger event that caused the Great Depression. All right. It was not one of the major causes. Okay. The major causes would take place during the 1920s. long-term causes. The crash of the market is a trigger event. It's an extreme short-term cause. This collapse, the Great Depression, would take place both in the United States and around the world, particularly in Europe. All right, massive unemployment would take place, 25% unemployment. 1 out of every 4 workers were out of work. Thousands, and I'm not exaggerating, thousands upon thousands of banks would end up failing and having to close. People would have their homes foreclosed upon, which means that they could not afford to make their payments on their homes, and the bank would have to foreclose or take their home away. There were thousands of soup kitchens, bread lines across the country in large cities, and many people started to live, like you see here down in the bottom, in these makeshift shanty towns known as Hoovervilles, because many people would blame President Herbert Hoover for the Great Depression because the government not doing enough or not responding appropriately during the Great Depression. The causes of the Depression, like I said, most of these took place during the 1920s. Okay, I talked about overproduction, both in the agricultural and in industry, the agricultural sector and in industry. There was excess supply, surplus of goods and services throughout the economy, and what this did generally is drove prices down for many of these industries, especially with farmers. In other words, the nations produced way more goods, the country produced way more goods than what were consumed. Okay, workers' wages did not keep up, did not increase enough. So there was an uneven distribution of wealth that was taking place throughout the country. There was too much reliance on credit. All right, so each one of these bullet points, these are your long-term causes of the Great Depression. You want to make sure you know these. There was too much reliance on credit, too much reliance on the installment plan. There was massive consumer debt that started to be built up. People started to default on their loans, simply meaning they couldn't afford to pay back their loan. Many banks failed as a result of that. And then on top of it all, you had some major international economic problems, right? World War I was coming to an, or World War I had ended, but throughout the decades, European countries were slow to recover, right? They were not buying American agricultural or industrial goods as much as they used to be. They had massive debts of their own that they owed to the United States, specifically Germany. And the high tariff, that might be, according to economists, the #1 major cause of the Great Depression. The high tariff, when the United States government raised the tariff to just very high levels on goods coming from Europe, Europe responded with high tariffs of their own. And that started a trade war, a tariff war, that led to trade basically shutting down, and Great Depression basically ended up happening by 1929. So we're back to our review page. We went through all of these bullet points. That's essentially wrapping up chapter 22 notes on the 1920s. The nice thing here about the video lecture, of course, you can listen to pieces of this. You can go back and listen to me again. Certain segments, listen to this while you're taking notes, perhaps if you're doing the optional study guide. But I'm going to be posting this into the resource folder, the unit resource folder, and I'll just name this Mr. Ristau's Chapter 22 video lecture. All right. So hope you got a lot out of this, guys, and we'll see you in class. Bye for now.